Well, hello everyone and welcome. I'm Stephanie Pedroza, Marketing Manager for Origo Software Technologies. I want to thank you for joining us today for Origo's webinar series. At Origo, we work with capital owners all the time, and the issue of equity gaps comes up frequently in both planning as well as when you're executing your plan, for example, in WMBE participation. In today's webinar, we will be discussing a topic that gets overlooked in our industry. Narrowing equity gaps in public agencies is of high importance and needs to be discussed. Industry leaders will share how agencies are addressing equality in their organizations and offer advice on how to reduce the equity gap in public agencies. A few quick notes before we get started. This webinar will be recorded and we will provide all registered participants with the recording. The slides will also be provided to all registered participants. We ask that you please submit any questions throughout the webinar via the Q&A chat box below, and we will answer any questions at the end of the presentation. If we don't answer all the questions during the available time, we will follow up with you via email. And joining me today is my colleague and marketing director, Richard Kramer, who will be moderating today's webinar. Hello, Richard.
Afternoon, Stephanie.
Awesome. And before we get started, we're going to launch a quick poll just because we want to get to know who's in our audience. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. And if you can just let me know, we want to know whether you're a project manager, capital planning, an engineer, consultant. All right, it looks like we have a lot of project managers, a lot of engineers. Okay. And then Richard, can you see the poll?
I can, yeah. It's sort of evenly split. We have about a quarter of our folks identifying as project managers, and about another quarter is other. And in third place, with about 15%, is folks identifying themselves in an administrative role, but quite a few capital planning and finance folks as well. So, yeah,
very interesting.
Thanks and welcome.
All right, so I am going to close the poll, and you can see the results and just kind of see who's in the audience. So, all right, so we'll continue. All right, and now I'm super excited to introduce our star panel of experts. And joining us today, we have Jennifer Cohen, CEO of Leadership Delaware, who led the Delaware Department of Transportation under two governors, where she led agency-wide reforms and produced the largest capital program in state's history. Prior to her appointment as secretary, Jennifer served as the director of the Delaware Division of Motor Vehicles as the first woman to do so. Her state public service career spanned more than 31 years. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us. Oh, and I believe you're on mute.
Thank you for having me. It's a really exciting topic and very timely, so thank you guys.
Yeah. And next we have Anthony Andrews, Senior Program Manager at the City of Dallas, has almost 2 decades of experience with capital program planning and implementation. He's currently managing airfield-based programs within the Dallas airport system, which includes Love Field. Prior to getting engaged in the aviation industry, Anthony worked with a general contractor that specialized in working with church build-outs in minority neighborhoods. He has an insider view of the equity landscape and how it's evolved over the years. Anthony, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. I hope I hold up as well as Jennifer and Diane. They're the heavy hitter here.
Oh, I'm sure you will do fantastic, and we're happy to have you here. And finally, we have Diane Gutierrez-Cachetti, Commissioner of the New Jersey Department of Transportation, who was confirmed as the 19th Commissioner in 2018. Diane is a transportation professional with over 3 decades of experience in the industry, and she possesses extensive executive, operational, and planning knowledge. Her accomplishments in leadership have been recognized by the Executive Woman of New Jersey, WTS Central Florida Woman of the Year, and Orlando Business Journal's 2015 CEO of the Year of Public Sector. Diane, it's great to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us.
It is absolutely a pleasure to be with you, Stephanie. Anthony, you are probably closer to this than Jen and I ever get. So I think with a group of colleagues who can provide great insight into this topic.
Awesome. Well, let's get started. It's a great topic, so I'll hand the stage over to Richard.
All right. Thank you, Stephanie. A very good afternoon from me to everybody in the audience. I'm excited for this discussion. As Stephanie mentioned, I think this is a topic that just doesn't get enough attention in our industry. Honestly, I was a I wondered how much interest we would get in this topic, but the response has actually been exceptional. This is probably going to be one of our best attended webinars ever. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us. You can see today's agenda on the screen. We're going to be talking about what equity gaps are themselves, trends, how it impacts hiring, how it impacts community participation, and so on. So let's dive right in, and I'll move to the next slide. So first of all, equity can be a pretty broad topic, and we do want to discuss the different aspects of racial equity, gender equity, as well as other dimensions such as age and disability. And you'll see we have different stats on the screen to kind of, back up the points that we're discussing. And so there's a lot of data out there on the gaps along racial and gender lines. And we threw in the kind of topical one there, which was Transportation Secretary Buttigieg caused some controversy a few months ago because he said that racism was actually built into our highway system. And half the internet kind of laughed at that and said, how can a highway system be racist? And then people went off and did some research and found out exactly what he was talking about. So, and we're going to get into a bit of that history a little bit later, I think, as well. So as sort of an introduction, my first question to the panelists is, how has the issue of equity affected the agency or the agencies that you've worked with and your own careers? And I'd like to start with Jen.
Sure, thank you, Richard. And I do recall when the secretary made that comment. I'm actually glad he made that comment because I absolutely agree with him because it's true. So I think step one in the planning process is acknowledging that is true. And I can tell you from a Delaware perspective, in our main city, our largest city in our state, we built I-95 right down the middle of it in the 60s and completely segregated those neighborhoods. So really understanding and admitting that is a truth and it is a factor that needs to be addressed, I think is number one. I also believe that people will sometimes get equality and equity mixed up. So equity is something that you really have to make a conscious effort because you can't treat all people equitably, equally, but the equity is a little bit different. You got to make special efforts. And quite frankly, if you look at some of these statements on this slide, you can see that extra efforts need to be made for the underserved populations. And, again, that has happened in every major city and not just necessarily built into our infrastructure in the brick and mortar kind of way, but also if you look at public transportation in the areas where it is needed the most, and rural areas are completely left out of that. So there's got to be a conscious effort to make sure that you understand that infrastructure, has had some significant racism built in, and not that it was a bad thing when it happened, is I just don't think people were even thinking about that. And making sure that not only as part of your planning process, when you're coming up with your projects and your capital plan, you need to make sure that you have the right people. I'm a firm believer if your board or your employees do not represent the people that you're serving, then something is definitely intrinsically wrong with your planning process. So making sure that happens as you start developing your plans. And you guys, everybody in the transportation industry knows that it could take 10 years of planning, right away, design, permitting, just to get to the construction piece of it. So this is such a timely conversation, and making sure that you understand the difference between equity and equality, and making sure that you understand how it was built into your program, and making sure you're putting things in place right now on the planning side to make sure that is addressed for all equitably. So in my personal career, sadly, well, not sadly, it's kind of still proud of it. It's sad to me that women are still having first. I was the first woman to run the Department of Motor Vehicles in Delaware. Mm-hmm. And people are still having first all over this country. So I think, it's out there, and you gotta take it on head on. And I, kudos to our new transportation secretary for actually taking it on. And we'll talk a little bit more about the major infrastructure bill and some of the things in that later on in this webinar. But yeah, you gotta acknowledge it right up and address it head on.
Yeah. Thank you, Jen. Same question to you, Anthony. How have you seen it affect the city of Dallas that you've been working with for a long time, and tell us about how it's affected your career a little bit.
Yeah, that has been a major emphasis in the city for quite a time. Current mayor, and I can recall several mayors in particular, were talking about the equitable use of land, infrastructure, in particular economic development here in the city. We're very well blessed on the northern half of our city, and we're challenged on the southern half of our city, and it happens to be somewhat of a dividing line in regards to racial lines. So, we're having challenges, but we're taking new approaches every year about it. Starting with the economic development organization being put in the city to start to look at how can we make gains in that area, Grow South initiative and those kind of things. So I applaud like Jen said, identifying there's an issue and starting to attack the issue. Now, getting some gains is the next major challenge in it. Of course, things like infrastructure bills and support that the federal government has provided through some COVID relief and those kind of things can help us get some gains along that line. I think, it's always a real challenge. I know, Richard, you talked about, how can a highway be racist? And I think for the most part, I've always, growing up in late 70s and 80s, for the most part, if I were looking for Black people, it was near a railroad track or a river, for the most part. But, that was just kind of following, in some cases, some logical lines from an engineering standpoint to put something somewhere. But the services associated with serving those communities and how you balance those services on one side of the railroad track or the road or the river has always been a challenge. So I've seen it. You make adjustments, you try to make sure you're engaged in the solution. I think that's the biggest thing that you have to be involved in, is to be engaged in the solution as opposed to just complain.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Anthony. Diane, same question to you. What's your overall take on the topic? I think you're on mute.
I think that's going to take over the "can you hear me now"
Yes,
line. Are you on mute? You're on mute. So I think, Richard, from my standpoint, I agree a lot with both what Jen and Anthony have said. I think from Anthony's perspective, he's literally, clearly more boots on the ground to a large extent than DOTs are. So I really want to acknowledge his really much more intimate role in the community sometimes than a DOT has. And I do agree with Jen. The first real step forward, it's like the 12 steps of figuring out DOTs do these things, is acknowledgement and understanding that sometimes the criteria we use in developing our capital plans does not always include, or has not in the past, let me say it that way, included a strong equity component. And so today, I know here at New Jersey DOT, we have begun the process of including the equity evaluation when we're looking at projects from concept development. So when you do this, you do have to look at projects from what we call concept to concrete, right? You have to look at the project and how is it that you build equity in and address the needs of perhaps communities, and sadly didn't think about before. I will not agree that there's been malice in the development of highway projects. I think it's more a level of, and not even to use the word ignorance in the strictest sense, but just not paying attention. We're civil engineers for the most part here, and we think very, linearly, like we build roads and this is what we do and this is where they go. And frankly, not really considering any type of neighborhood it goes through, whether it's an underserved community or a wealthy community. The difference is that the wealthy community has much more ability to have public involvement. And so from our perspective, it really is about making sure that public involvement is broad enough that we reach out to these smaller communities that we might negatively impact, and make sure we're hearing from them, hearing about their needs, hearing about their concerns, and then adding them into the project development before the project gets into preliminary design. What are we doing to make sure that there's equity in the way the project rolls out. And I think we've tried here at DOT to certainly do that with our projects, but one place where we were able to quickly do it is in our grant programs. And so we at DOT spend about $430 million a year providing county and municipal grants. And we have built in equity to the rating process. So in other words, we make sure that communities who are most in need of those grant funds receive those grant funds. It's not that we don't like our middle and upper class neighborhoods, but they have a far better opportunity from a property tax standpoint to address some of those projects where our poorer communities don't. So we have already implemented some of those changes. Governor Murphy has been very, very key with us in making certain that we focus on not only rural, but in some cases, some of our urban communities that, you know, are truly suffering what we call the highway divide, those racist highways that broke neighborhoods. That's a lot more of an urban issue than some of our rural communities that have nothing, right? So they may have preferred that highway over zero, where the urban area says, but that highway has hurt us. So we have a lot of what I'll call retrofitting to do, kind of planning how we fix it. But it really comes from an acknowledgement that there's something to fix. And I would have to say pretty confidently, certainly at the federal level and at the state levels as well, we do acknowledge that there is something we have to address. The question is going to be how we successfully address it, given the fact that it's hard to move large infrastructure.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's always, I heard someone once describe a capital program to me like an oil tanker. You know, it just takes a long time to make adjustments because of the size. So definitely. Let's thank you, panel. Let's move on to the second thing we want to talk about, which is around the same thing, but let's talk about trends, you know, recently. So it does, you know, feel like we're all talking about it a little bit more, which is great. But you know, some of you have alluded to that already. I mean, is that enough? And how do we really measure success, I guess? And I'd like to start with Anthony.
Wow, how do you measure success in that? That's a function of the audience in a lot of cases. Like Diane mentioned, that the engagement with the community helps us get an idea for what are the measurables, what are the true measurables, not necessarily. As engineers, we think straight lines and angles and those kind of things. So it's fairly easy to go from point A to point B and say this is the easiest route, or as a project manager to just think about cost associated with it. But there are measures that need to be taken into account each time you put together a project or put together a capital program that says, you know, in particular here, since I work here at Love Field, our director talks about we're an airport that's in a community, and we need to kind of flip that around to be a community that happens to be around near an airport. So it's a frame of reference from the standpoint of understanding that how those activities you do affect your community and how your community may absorb those items. And that'll kind of give you your idea for your measuring points, because, you know, again, for me, it's, you know, I'm a capital planner, I'm an engineer, I'm going to be, which one is cheaper, which one is faster, you know, but, you know, I have to be conscious of the fact that, you know, there are other measures to be taken into account.
Yeah, thank you. And Diane, you mentioned, I guess briefly that you actually factor it into, is that sort of a standard scoring model that you have when you're evaluating different projects, and you have, you know, equity as one of those attributes that has to be considered when you're building out the program? Is that right?
And that's correct, Richard. So we have, when the grant applications come in here, we have a staff that reviews them against a set of criteria, a point system, which is public. It's not a secret. And so we look at how we rank the projects. And then once they're all ranked by DOT, to ensure that we've properly evaluated them, we use a panel of 10 municipal engineers who kind of review our work and kind of make sure that we've applied the criteria successfully. And a lot of times, and I'll use bicycle and pedestrian grants as an example, that's a really important, for me, an important piece of making sure we can reconnect communities that may have been split by highways. right? Creating pedestrian bridges and bicyclists being able to use those bridges as well to get from one side of a highway to the other safely. Making sure we have a traffic signal infrastructure that is safe for people to cross and easily walk back and forth. I don't know that we'll ever get to the point where we like relocate a highway, which we've been, since this topic has come up, we've been asked to do.
It's come up.
It's almost an impossibility, because then you just impact an entirely different neighborhood. And it was almost impossible in the world of environmental regulation and right-of-way acquisition rules. Would be very, very difficult. So the real goal is to look at how can we help communities? How can we support communities in helping them be rejoined? And the way we do that is obviously through grant programs where they are in control of their own future. But it's also through some of our larger projects where we can add some of these elements into the project as we're building. And that is really, to me, that is the key, to make sure that you have those criteria being evaluated and that you have a staff that has the creativity and the open mind to start looking at this as a really important factor. Transportation is the economic driver of all of our states. That's just, I often am known to say, if we were going for an Academy Award, we would get it for best supporting actor. We're never going to get, leading lady, leading man. Nope. We support so much of what else goes on. And so it's important for us to have proper outreach, proper incorporation into projects, and certainly grant programs that provide additional opportunity for communities to continue to build and to be successful in the equity area.
Yeah, thank you. Jen, same question to you. What have you been seeing sort of recently? How do we measure success? Are there specific things that agencies could be doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially in the measurement field, Richard, it boils down to quality of life, right? Quality of life for all of the citizens in your state. So if you have a prioritization process and quality of life, whatever you want to call it in your jurisdiction, isn't part of that conversation, then that's going to be problematic, because you're just doomed to repeat the same thing that we've been doing for the last, 5 decades. So really quality of life focus, which means it's going to take, I go back to that equality versus equity, that's going to take extra effort to the marginalized communities. It's just, they don't get their information the same way. They don't communicate the same way. They, believe it or not, they don't all have smartphones. 15% of our country citizens are still unbanked. So it really is going to take that extra effort to go out into the community, into the areas that are going to be impacted. And then there's this theme that's happening, and it's actually included in the new infrastructure bill that's being debated, is instead of, because Diane's 100% right, you can't just move a highway, right? But there's this trend and continuing conversations about capping these major arteries that have gone through these towns and cities across the country, and then putting a park on top, or something like that. So things that DOTs, both state and local, aren't used to putting in their project. They pave and they build bridges and overpasses and those things, but it's thinking, okay, well, let's think about, hey, how can we add a park to this project, or how can we add a community amenity? And it doesn't always have to be a bike path in concrete right next to a roadway. It could be a pedestrian pathway. It's got to be a multimodal conversation, but really focusing on that quality of life.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I do. I like the sort of specific example of the bike tracks and the pedestrian stuff as a way to mitigate it. Great, thank you. If anyone in the audience is interested in learning more about the topic, very easy just to go on and Google, search. YouTube has a lot of great videos on the history of the highway system. In particular, I found a lot around Detroit and around Miami seems to be the two big stories, but it's very easy to find, very, very fascinating. So, let's move on to the next topic, which is a little more specific around, hiring itself. Obviously any industry, whether you're in the public sector, private sector, it all comes down to the people and the folks that actually work there and able to execute the plan. So let's talk a bit about our workforce in capital planning, construction, and so on. And Diane, I'll start with you this time. How do we ensure we're attracting the right woman, the right minority talent at our public agencies?
So for New Jersey, Richard, and I think maybe Jen experienced a little bit this, I'm not sure on Anthony's side. We are guided to a large extent by our Civil Service Commission. So it is often difficult for us to really look at a broad candidate pool and select those who we believe help create the diversity we need in the department, because civil service is really a seniority-based, test-based system. However, having said that, I am pleased that the DOT on its own has really worked hard to balance its workforce. And the place that we probably are lacking the most in terms of diversity balance is out in the field with our maintenance crews. And honestly, to some extent, I would suggest to you, I'm okay with that. I don't know that I can ever change that particular balance, but inside the DOT, we have, through a series of opportunities, been able to really balance our managers and our professionals and executives in terms of both gender and race. And so are we where we should be? No. Have we made a lot of progress? Yes. I don't think there'll ever be a day where I'll say we are where we should be, because the dynamics constantly change. So I think what we have to look at is not so much do we pick the right people all the time, because most folks come here with a relatively open mind. It really is the attitude or the leadership of the department, and them, people like Jen and I have had the opportunity to instill what we believe are the priorities of the department in how we select projects and how we administer our programs. So I always say, we've been playing the game follow the leader most of our lives, right? Probably since we're about 5. People follow their leadership. And if the leadership deems this to be an important piece of what we do, then leadership will make sure that as we consider internal promotions where we have flexibility, that diversity becomes an important factor in how we select those promotions where we have discretion, that we balance the workforce, that when we interview folks in that arena, that we make sure we've interviewed a broad cross-section of those who want to work at the department, and we truly make sure that those opportunities are available. One thing we've done with our young folks here at DOT who come to us, many of them come to us as project managers, which I found interesting in your survey. When you become a project manager as a civil engineer, you don't always get the design hours you need to sit for your PE exam. And so we started a program here where we actually provide design hours to those project managers that show interest. We have a mentoring program for these young engineers. They sit and they get small design projects that they do kind of off of their normal, work day if they're interested. And so far, of the 45 or 50 people that have enrolled, 5 of them have successfully achieved the hours and gotten their PEs. And a lot of them are our young, more diverse employees as they're coming out of college, right? So yes, losing women in leadership because the pandemic changed the dynamic for many, but hopefully bringing them in at the other side and raising them up to be strong leaders of the department. You can be a leader and not be in leadership. Let's be clear. You can be a leader wherever you are. So we work hard on that, but we work under several constraints that don't make it easy for us always to, really balance solely on diversity. Because we do deal with civil service. And I don't know if Jen has civil service, she'll tell us in a minute. But at the end of the day, it does hamstring us just a little bit.
Yeah, I guess, yeah. And those roles often tend to be very niche, I guess, where you're looking for particular experience. So that, you just have a smaller pool. That's the reality you have to kind of deal with. So yeah, Jen, what are your thoughts on how we can sort of attract the right folks? I know you had mentioned the fact that about the changing demographics based on the pandemic as well. So could we maybe drill into that, talk about that as well?
Sure. And I encourage everybody, and I agree with Diane, it's tough to do, but there are efforts that you can make. But I would encourage everybody to go to McKinsey.com and read their Women in the Workplace report. They've been doing it since 2015. It's the most comprehensive report on women in the workplace around the globe. I used to get excited. I would get it every January, and I'm like, oh, right, we're making progress in STEM fields and C-suites, and guys, the pandemic just turned it all on its head. I mean, the report indicates that 1 out of every 4 women have either downsized their career or left the workforce altogether just because of dealing with everything that the pandemic, kind of dealt out with, e-learning at home and taking care of, seniors. We're going backwards. So it's very disturbing. But there are things that we can do, in Delaware, we did targeted STEM events, right? Because we always had, once you're at the university, we would have interns come in, engineering field, construction field, whatever. But what we found is by the time they're in college, they already basically know what they want to do. So it's not necessarily getting them at that level, but really getting them at the younger level. And what we focused on is the 5th and 6th grades. So we had a STEM event for girls from all over the state. And we were really targeting, we worked with the counselors in the schools to target girls who were super smart, but wouldn't have normally received the opportunities to actually attend anything like that. So, I'm a firm believer that talent's distributed equally, but opportunity is not. So it's got to be a deliberate effort. And I'll tell just a quick story, because you also have to deal with the consequences when you bring those people on. My favorite story is, this is on, the operations side, but I wanted female mechanics so bad. I'm like, we had 0 female mechanics throughout the entire state. And we finally got a few of them, and they were in the same county. And then there was a snowstorm. And of course, it's all hands on deck for snowstorms. And then they actually bunk at their locations. And then we're like, well, crap, we don't have separate facilities for females and males because we never had this issue because we never had any females. So really, you're going to have to dive really deep, not into, just your recruiting process. And Diane's right. I mean, we are limited from a state standpoint a little bit, but you can go find that high school person and just track them and keep checking in on them, knowing that you will find something for them in your organization. But it's got to be that concerted effort. You got to try to get them young. And make sure they know that these are cool fields. It's cool to be a smart girl engineer, especially a minority engineer. It's awesome. But it's tough, and sadly we are going backwards a little bit.
Yeah, I think I mean, I hadn't, when you mentioned the pandemic thing to me, I hadn't thought about it. It kind of clicked for me because and I can attest that that's sort of happened to my own family a little bit, that my wife's taken on most of the burden of keeping the kids at home and stuff. So yeah, totally understandable. Anthony, any comments from you on sort of hiring or anything like that? The other question I had for Anthony is what advice, so, you have a couple of decades experience under your belt. What advice would you give someone who's new and maybe just entering the field based on the experiences you've gone through?
To the first part about hiring, city, so there is a civil service component to the city. In regards to, the city is always trying to be reflective of its citizens, and we attempt, like the DOTs, to try to be reflective of the citizens that are part of it. But in the end, hiring talent is talent. And there's no dispute that people that are talented need to have the opportunity to be engaged. So, you do your best to ensure that the pool that you're going to pick from is the best. And that's what Jen was referring to in regards to being engaged in career days. I was watching Iron Fist last night. No, don't ask me why. But so one comment in particular on there was about a single arrow is not strong, but a quill of 10 is stronger. So, and I'll relate that to Jen's comment that, me individually doing career days is a single arrow, but me encouraging others to do that, to be engaged in the National Society of Black Engineers, to be Society of Women Engineers, to get into the STEM field, makes that 10 arrow component stronger. So therefore that pool is broader and deeper. And, growing up in Georgia, at one time my competition would have been in the next county, maybe the next state. Now it's international from the standpoint because, the world is smaller at this point, just by the fact that we're all over the country right now talking to each other. So you have to be broad in your thought, broad in the idea that your engagement to affect people and to help them see that there's some real benefit to being in STEM and to being in project management and to be the leaders of DOTs and the leadership of Delaware. That those things have a net effect that can be a benefit to you in the long term. And the second, I guess I kind of answered that second part of the question in regards to advice for it is be engaged. You know, I at one time as a young engineer thought, if I do my job well, that should be enough. It isn't, you know, because for twofold. One, I have a responsibility to those who gave me the opportunity to give back. You know, so that's one part. And two, if I want to move forward, I really need to make sure that people understand that I have a broader sense of my job beyond just being here between 8 to 5. Being engaged in the community does help the community, and it does in some cases help yourself.
Yeah, really, and I like what you folks said about how engineers tend to think in straight lines a little bit, and how it helps to sort of come up and see the bigger picture. Absolutely. Great. So thank you. Let's move on to the next thing we were going to discuss, which we brought up a little bit, but it's all about community, involvement. And the quote you see there is from another article, which is very interesting, from the Atlantic, actually talking about the history of redlining and infrastructure and community involvement around Syracuse in upstate New York, which was really interesting. So yeah, I guess a question for you, Jennifer: how do we make sure that we involve the right folks in the process from the public?
Yeah, that's absolutely tough. And one of the benefits of the pandemic, I'm a big believer in you never waste a crisis, is that being able to shift to a lot of virtual meetings and virtual public hearings. In Delaware, we saw our participation in those conversations go way up. So I think that's something that's going to be here to stay. And we did an experiment back in 2019 and into 2020 before the pandemic hit. We have a major traffic snarl in our beach resort areas, right? And back in 2007, we went out to the public like we normally do and said, here's these 10 options, which do you prefer? They didn't want any of them. So we had to, there's the whole social justice thing. We couldn't go in and do the project. So what we did in 2019 and 2020 is we did it in reverse. We went and got the community involved from the very beginning. We set up, even though I hate task force, we set up a task force, and we got people from every impacted community, including some of the minority communities. But it was really difficult. You got to go to, we went to their churches and, said who can speak for this group of people, because we want to make sure no one is marginalized in this conversation. And, that was, 6-9 month long process, but completely opposite of what we normally do. So getting them involved on the front end. And the result that we got was over 36 different projects that they will support going forward and that we can move on. So I think trying to flip that on its head sometimes in some of the most, congested areas, or where you have the most involvement from the community, is going out to them first before you even go to design. I think that's definitely something. I know we're going to talk about the infrastructure bill, but, once all the political squabbling is over, we're going to have an infrastructure bill. And the one that's being proposed right now has $1 billion to reconnect communities. And that's everything from, it says planning, design, demolition, reconstruction grids, parks, or other infrastructure. And when you throw that other infrastructure word in there, that basically is it's the fire hose that you can use. Now, with that is going to come a ton of federal strings. So I think making sure that everybody has their ducks in the row, because this money is going to come, and it's going to come fast, but there's going to be a lot of strings. And this community involvement and social justice is going to be really, really important. And if you don't have that in your mind for your capital planning right now, you better get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've all been watching the news, I think, with a lot of attention with this infrastructure bill going through. So I think we can expect an update in another month or so from the House side, I think. So I feel like everyone's been waiting for about 12 years in our industry for this thing. So yeah, we're all very keen. So Diane, and what's your experience been at New Jersey DOT with community? Did you have that same issue with the pandemic and going virtual? How has that panned out for you?
Well, so we did. And so I agree 100% with Jen. Virtual public involvement is here to stay. And so one of the things we were tasked with to do early on in the pandemic is we did a toll adjustment on the New Jersey Turnpike and Garden State Parkway, which was underway just before the pandemic really became more aggressive. And so a lot of folks were like, well, how can you do this during a pandemic? How do you get public input? Frankly, we did a couple of live public hearings, but we also combined it with virtual access. And frankly, we've never had so much public input at a toll hearing ever, right? So when you only have an in-person hearing, it's very limited to the number of people who can attend, because even though we do them in the afternoon and the evening to try to capture the largest number of folks who might want to participate, and people are home doing homework with their children, they're cooking dinner, they're food shopping, they're working 2 jobs. There's 100 reasons why a person can't attend in person, but there's almost 0 reasons why they can't dial in. And so we provided phone access. We put it up on our website. We allowed public comment for a longer period of time. In other words, if you couldn't attend, you could listen to the hearing and submit written comment. And frankly, we never had such large engagement in that process. And so good, bad, or indifferent, it is the way we will continue to do business. We do it now. Frankly, it has become a market unto itself for a lot of our consulting firms who have developed all kinds of different platforms for us to use for public engagement. And it was really successful. And I think most successful because some of our more underserved communities, generally, they don't come out. They just feel like they're not going to be heard if they're one person standing there in the midst of 100 or 50. In this case, I think they were much more comfortable doing it on the phone and just being able to share their concerns with us. And so I think public involvement from a virtual perspective will stay. It'll be a hybrid. We'll have in person, but we will also always have phone access. And so we'll continue that. The hard part of public engagement is we generally don't respond during the public engagement portion. We take the input, we respond at a later date. I think that was a little difficult for people who've never really participated before to understand why we're not answering them on the spot. It doesn't become a debate. And frankly, we need to go back and take their comments and make sure we have all the facts. So we'll continue to do that. We have a program here called Commitment to Communities at New Jersey DOT, where we're making sure, and I agree with Jen 100%, that concept development process, the very first thing you do is involve your stakeholders, because you don't want to go back and redesign something after the fact. It's expensive, it's a waste of time, it prolongs the life of the project. The other thing I would say is key is involving your communications people from the very beginning. So we have communications and government relations people that work at our DOTs that serve us, and they need to be involved in the project from the first day of development. So from that day, they understand what's going on, and they can really help us with the communications piece. So it isn't just our engineers who kind of get tasked with kind of changing the way they think, but it's our engineers working with our communications team to make sure the message is always succinct and it is addressed to the people who are asking the questions, not just the same answer we give to everybody that comes through. So really involving communications folks, from my perspective, from the first day on any project is really key to making sure the project is successful and that people are satisfied that they were heard.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. We have a number of DOT customers ourselves, and when the pandemic hit, we were approached by several of them to develop a solution for public engagement. So that's something we've been working on. We're actually getting close to releasing that as well. So I think I agree. I think it's going to become the norm, and then we'll have this hybrid sort of approach between virtual, which has advantage. It's more automated. You can respond quicker, I think. Maybe not as rich as the in-person type stuff. So you've got to sort of have a balance between the two. Anthony, what's your perspective on community involvement? What are you folks doing down there in Dallas with regard to that?
our airport in particular went through a major renovation completed in about 2014. And because this is a 100-year-old airport that's been here for the longest, in fact, we're working on a runway right now. We're finding old basements because it used to be homes, and it's converted into an airport. So, the community is right outside our fence line. And I want to quote I misquoted my director. I know I'm going to see him in the hallway in a minute. So that we're an airport in a neighborhood, but we want to be a neighbor that happens to be an airport is the correct quote. But so because of this engagement and our close proximity to everyone, that we've engaged into regular what we call good neighbor program or good neighbor plan quarterly meetings. So we were doing those on a quarterly basis live, and of course COVID hit and we went to a virtual format. And you're so right, Diana, in regards to less direct engagement in regards to, it's not as much of a tennis match in regards to call and response associated with questions, but it also allows the message to come out fully and to get the answers back fully, as opposed to it being potentially derailed sometimes by either the presenter or the person asking the question. So, this has been kind of a norm. I think it's going to be a standard from here on out, because it does allow us to get engaged on a broader sense. Before, when we were doing our quarterly meetings, we were meeting in one of our quadrants that are close to our neighborhood. So on purpose, moving around in quadrants, to pick up a certain aspect of the neighborhood. And it was open to all, but it was moving to a certain quadrant. But now at this point, we can get all quadrants in virtually at this point, pick up, everyone get the same basic information at the same time and be engaged. So it's been very helpful for us. I prefer it because, I can take off the shoes actually at that meeting, if it's virtual versus the live one, but not most of the time I keep the shoes on, but.
All right. Thank you, panel. Let's move on to, this is our last slide. And what we want to do is just look forward to the future, I guess. So I'd like to ask the panel, first of all, how are you feeling? Are you feeling optimistic for the next few years ahead? And why? And how do you see agencies and communities benefiting from this increased focus on the topic? So, everything that's in the infrastructure bill that we touched on, and this focus on equity. And Diane, let me start with you. Optimistic or not?
Oh, I am optimistic, Richard. I think that the focus, has been so strong over the past about 15 months that I think it would be hard for us to turn back from it. I think it really would be tone deaf on our part to act as though this is going to fade back into the sunset. And it shouldn't, for a whole variety of reasons. Internally at the department, I think, Governor Murphy, prior to all of the focus on equity, engaged in relieving both salary compression and pay equity. And so the Diane B. Allen Act in New Jersey was meant to correct inequities in pay between employees, and obviously vastly the pay to women versus men. And we examine our positions today. We all went through a very, very significant exercise to ensure that we are paying people who do the same job are being paid the same salary. And it has been very helpful, both from a morale standpoint and certainly a self-respect standpoint. You don't want to have to argue, why do I get 70 cents on the dollar given the guy sitting next to me over here when I'm doing the same thing. I think teaching people that we price jobs and not people is also important. So it's the job we're paying for. If the person, regardless of the person who does it, they should be qualified and talented. I think that's helped a lot. I think we still have a lot to do in really crafting the process of building this into our projects. That is relatively new. So I'm very optimistic it will continue to grow and be improved upon, so that we are doing, as Jen said, engaging, if it's 36 or 5 or 10 communities, whatever that stakeholder group may be, in getting their feedback and understanding their needs of a project before we build, before we design. being very honest, we won't always be able to incorporate everything everyone needs. But I think the real first step is being good, active listeners, right? Not just paying lip service to it, but being good, active listeners, understanding, and then trying to respond accordingly to build as much into projects as we can. Looking at the screen and some of the questions that have come through, why do we place things where we do? There's environmental issues, there's right-of-way issues, there's a whole host of things. There's state historic preservation issues. It's not easy to pick what we call the preferred alignment. But at the end of the day, when we do, I think there's so much we need to consider in terms of the communities we impact. They have to become our priority. I have to tell the State Historic Preservation Office, look, I appreciate that you like this brick, but maybe I take your brick and put it someplace where it's more useful and I can serve this community, and really balancing those needs. Not something that has always been easy to do, but we'll get better at it, just like we've gotten better at everything we do the longer we do it. And I think so. I am optimistic we can get there.
Thank you. Anthony, same question to you. How are you feeling about the next few years ahead?
I'm cautiously optimistic. I'll say that what I'm hearing and starting to read does make me think that things are moving in the right direction. I have to admit, part of this, the caution in me, is a function of having heard some of the stories before, in regards to from the U.S. and in regards to we're ready to move forward, civil rights and so forth, and to a point where it stops and it becomes, this is far enough. So my goal may be a little bit further than what we have right now in front of us. But I think, the steps are positive. I'm encouraged by them. I think there's some real gains to be made in a broader sense. Really encouraged by, my fellow panelists being engaged, because, when you get the right people engaged that can see a broader picture, that's the beginning of the P at the top of the snow hill. It can pick up speed and start to move on its own. So I applaud Diane and Jen for putting the P at the top of the snow hill here and moving things along, because it's going to help us. It's going to help, hopefully our politicians, because they'll only go as far as we push them. That's really the key thing here. It's, in some cases, there are those rare politicians that move because they hear the beat of their own drum, but most of them need to be pushed. I'm a city employee, but I'm also a citizen. I have a voice, and it needs to be made available so that everyone understands that I have expectations for a bright future for my kids and for my grandkids.
Yeah, thank you. So we before we get to our audience questions, I just want to remind folks, if you do have a question, please type it into the Q&A chat and we'll get to it. So Jen, last word to you. How are you feeling? Optimistic or not for the future? What do you see happening?
So I'm always a wild-eyed optimist. I'm definitely optimistic for the future. I think Diane's right. I don't think any state jurisdiction, or even, in the private industry, in the transportation world, can get out of having these conversations at this point. And then if you just think, we will all have a better end product if we have the diversity and the planning and the engineering and the community involvement. We won't, the reason why we are where we are now is because we didn't have that back in the 50s and the 60s, right? So we have this infrastructure problem. So I think I'm optimistic because it is being talked about. I'm glad Anthony brought up the politicians. They need more than pushing sometimes. They need more than pushing sometimes, because what often happens, and this is across the country, is that the politicians will try to dictate where their transportation dollars go in their jurisdictions, and that, quite frankly, some of them are not interested in underserved areas because they may not vote for them. So really making sure that you do put that pushback on the politicians when they when they're trying to make decisions like that, and trying to push transportation in one way or the other. But I'm absolutely optimistic. And again, if we all do this and we all do it together, we will have such a better, more all-encompassing transportation system in this country. So I'm definitely an optimist.
All right, thank you. And thanks again to the panel. So we have a few minutes left for some audience questions, and I see some of them
Yeah,
have been
can you
coming in.
guys
So
hear me? I know I was having problems with my audio. Are we good?
I think you sound okay now, yeah.
Okay, we have great questions coming in. So we have about 5 minutes. And once again, if we don't get to these questions, we do apologize. We'll definitely answer back via email. So the first question came from Paul. He would be curious to learn more about what the equity criteria is used for grant project selection. So would any of our panelists know how to answer that? If you guys know what the criteria is for grant project selection?
I think that was
So
a
I
comment
can-
Diane
yeah.
made, yeah.
Yeah, I don't have them with me, but if he would like to go to the NJDOT website, our local aid group, he may see the applications there and describe some of the criteria that we use in reviewing applications. And if not, you can always share my contact information with him and we can see if we can help him more.
Awesome, thanks. And then the next question, there have been several comments around engaging all stakeholders in the concept and planning stages of capital improvement. How have you all and your organizations been making those connections with impacted communities while rearranging the trust of those who have been historically marginalized through infrastructure? So who would like to take a stab at that one?
I can take a stab at that one. That's an excellent question because it takes, deliberate efforts to do that. The first thing you need to do is you need to identify, your pockets of different communities in the state. I mean, and this happens in every state, happens in Delaware. We're a big retirement community state, right? So we know we have retirees in the resort areas. We know that we have rural agricultural communities in certain areas. We know we have Hispanic populations in certain areas throughout the state. So first thing you need to do is identify those different communities. And even our persons with disabilities, Delaware is the only state in the country that does door-to-door paratransit service. So we have a ton of persons with disabilities. So making sure you identify those different communities first. And then, all of them want to be communicated with differently. So make sure, Diane hit it on the head very well is, historically, what we would do is we would send our project engineer out to talk to the public about a project. That's the worst thing to do because no offense to engineers, I love you all, but you can't really talk in a kind of soundbite normal people understand language. So making sure you identify those different communities and that you're communicating with them the way that they need to be communicated with.
Awesome, thanks. And then the next question, do panelists see an opportunity through the new infrastructure bill to potentially roll back inequalities? And if so, do you see that being accomplished? And I know we talked a little bit about the infrastructure bill, but how do you see that being accomplished when that goes through?
So I think Jen hit it on the head. I think, there's $1 billion that's going to be sitting there for us to work through this issue. It'll be accomplished once we understand. And again, this is so hard because it's a bill. We don't know what will actually happen to it. But when it finally becomes a law and we understand that the rules of the game, the rules of engagement, so to speak, I think there'll be a lot of opportunity for transportation agencies at all level of government, state, local, to put in and to compete for funds that will be available to do the kinds of projects that help rejoin communities. I think the one thing that to me has been incredibly clear is that it is the goal of the Biden administration to really address the needs of our underserved communities. And so there's no doubt in my mind, well, there will always be strings attached to federal dollars. Maybe there'll be fewer in this case to allow for broader application of those funds with kind of less, I don't want to say paperwork because there's always paperwork, but with less consternation maybe.
We can only hope it's less paperwork.
Yeah.
Yeah.
can only
And now with technology, and if you guys mentioned it, with technology, we're getting more public engagement, everything's moving a lot smoother, but I am going to conclude this webinar with that last and final question. It's already about an hour in time, but if we didn't answer your questions, we will follow up. I want to thank the audience. I want to thank our panelists. This has been a great conversation. It's something that we do need to discuss more, and I hope everybody found this beneficial. And we will send everybody an email, and I hope everybody has a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.